and we are working through this concept of the Sabbath. Thank you, sir. I made the point last week, and I want to re-emphasize the point this week. I have benefited a lot from my study of the Sabbath. That being said, it is clear in Scripture that the Sabbath is not something that we are required by God to maintain or to practice today. Being part of a new covenant, and we don't have time to get into the facets of what the Bible talks about in regards to our Sabbath rest being completed in Jesus. So I hope that these two classes that we've taken to talk about the Sabbath will have inspired you to go and read and study. The passages I encourage you to take time to read and study are Colossians chapter 2, Hebrews chapter 4, and then to that I could also add Romans 14. So Hebrews 4 and Romans 14 are the main crux of what I would invite you to study and take time to look over, to talk about. If you have things that you want to discuss, though, discuss those with me. I have learned a ton about Sabbath rest, and I have so much information stored in my mind right now that in about 48 hours, it's just going to be gone. So I feel like I've been cramming for a test here, and I'm just ready to regurgitate it out. But Hebrews chapter 23, or sorry, Hebrews. There is no Hebrews 23, so don't go there. Leviticus 23, we're discussing this concept or this idea of the Sabbath. God invites his people to have holy assemblies, to regard these days and these festivals, these feasts as holy. And God is trying to do the very thing with his people then as he's trying to do with us now. Every commandment that he gives, every instruction that he gives, every observation and remembrance that he gives is to remind his people of the holy lives that they ought to be living. It is to be a Sabbath of complete rest to you, and you shall humble your souls. On the 9th month of the evening, from evening until evening, you shall keep your Sabbath. So these are the main takeaways from Sunday. Those feasts, or these feasts, celebrate God's provisions for his people. Food, rescue, bread, forgiveness, etc. And they are all divine interruptions. These are days that God is calling his people. You stop doing what you normally do. Stop doing what you're used to doing, and you focus and you think about what I'm calling you to do. I want you to focus on what the point of this might be and observe this specific thing that I have done for you in the past and remembering these holy days. So, man, I changed this and doesn't look right again. Anyway, so forget the lines. But there's two passages, and again, all this will be made available in some kind of study guide form soon and very soon. But there's two passages that I wanted you guys to look at and compare and contrast in terms of understanding what God has called his people to do. Exodus chapter 20, God says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Compare that to Deuteronomy chapter 5, where he says, and I'm sorry that it's down here, observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. What is the difference between remember and observe? Because they are different. They're different words. They're not the same word translated a different way. They're different words.
Remember means like mentally, and observe is an action, take action of some kind.
And what's so neat in remembering with your mind, it's a mental act, and observing a physical act, is that they kind of are a cyclical development, right? If you remember the Sabbath day, you're going to observe it. If you observe the Sabbath day, you're going to remember it. So God is creating basically this cyclical account where his people are going to remember and observe the Sabbath day and to keep it set apart, to keep it holy. Again, this is going to be from Sunday all the way through Friday at sundown. Friday at sundown begins their Sabbath, and their Sabbath, Their seventh day rest is going to be from Friday at sundown all the way through Saturday morning, all the way until the evening. That is the Sabbath day. There's a misconception, and I want to reiterate this. The Sabbath day did not become Sunday for the Christians. The Sabbath day did not become Sunday for the Christians. That is, we are not observing the Sabbath on our Sunday. That the Bible describes Sunday, the first day of the week, as the Lord's day, not the Sabbath day. That is an erroneous conclusion that you might come to. And in times it's been taught like that. They're not the same. Sabbath for them was Friday at sundown all the way through Saturday at sundown. So that's the day they're setting apart. God says, it explains the logistics behind it, what it looks like. That's repeated. But then you get to the why. Look at the why in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. So if I just had Exodus 20 and verse 11, why do I remember the Sabbath? God created the world in 6 days, and then he rested on the seventh. He rested on the Sabbath. I remember that in Exodus 20. Why do I observe the Sabbath? Well, he explains to us in verse 15, you shall remember, there's our other word, that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And the Lord your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So what's the why in Deuteronomy chapter 5? It's different. What's the why? You were a slave in Egypt. You were serving a master that was leading you to death. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. I gave you a new birth, a new creation. You passed through the waters that Paul would later say in 1 Corinthians 10 was in some ways a baptism. You were regenerated, and that's why I want you to remember the Sabbath, so that you can remember what I've done for you. The reasoning to remember and observe is because it helps us ultimately imitate God and to find our ultimate rest in what God has done. And we're going to start unpacking the suitcase here on these ideas. So the other things connected with the Sabbath are the number 7 is intentionally connected throughout the Bible. The word 7 represents full or complete. That's a study that's going to take you a long time. If you start trying to find the pattern of 7 in just your English Bibles, you're gonna be there a lot. If you start using a Hebrew Bible and start following the pattern of 7, it takes you even longer, especially if you don't read Hebrew, like I don't read Hebrew. It just takes that much longer. But it's intentional. And really, it comes down to this point. The rhythm of practicing the Sabbath or resting every Sabbath day is a way that we as humans can imitate our Creator, and we remember what He's done. So, what does all this mean? I found this quote. I thought it explained it well. Don't so much remember the quote, remember the highlights. So, set apart from all other days, so made holy, the blessing of the seventh day establishes the seventh part of created time. So God rested on the seventh day. It's a day that God said you ought to make holy and set apart. When God grants his presence in the created world. So he is resting, he has ceased from his labor. He has worked and labored for 6 days, now he's rested. It is then his presence that provides a blessing and the sanctification. Does that tie in at all to Leviticus? God's presence providing a blessing and sanctification. So I see heads saying yes. Explain it to me.
All the sacrifices, all the things that he's calling them to do are in order for them to maintain a relationship, to rid themselves of the sin and the things that could separate them. And it's all in an effort to have that bond and that closeness with their God.
When you end the book of Exodus, which we love to read Exodus, it reads like a narrative, right? It's not like Leviticus. Exodus ends with God making the tabernacle, or giving instructions to make the tabernacle, the place that's going to house God's presence, the place where man will meet with God. But then there's a problem at the end of Exodus, because Moses goes to the tabernacle, the place of meeting with God, and he's on the outside. He can't come into the meeting place with God. He's on the outside. So then we continue the narrative through Leviticus. And we haven't gotten there yet, but it's coming. If you read through Leviticus and you go all the way to Numbers, Numbers starts off with Moses being inside the tabernacle. The book of Leviticus worked. It was a way for God to put his presence in his people, to have his presence dwell among his people, and in that they were going to be richly blessed. You see the blessings and curses argument. All this is preparation for where we're going in Leviticus. You see the blessings and the curses that come from being sanctified, being set apart, being made holy, and having God's presence with you in Leviticus. The seventh day is blessed and established as part of the time that assures fruitfulness, future orientation, continuity, and permanence for every aspect of life within the dimension of time. We're going to talk about time later on in this class. The seventh day is blessed by God's presence for the sake of the created world, for all nature and for all living beings. If you want to read this book, it comes from the work called The Sabbath in the Pentateuch. This is coming from page 45. So there's two words that are used for rest basically throughout the Old Testament in Hebrew: nuach and Shabbat. Both words mean rest, but there's a different kind of rest that each one means. Nuach is defined as rest, just like Sabbath is, but nuach is more of like this relaxing, this settle down. It's often been described as a time of refreshing, repose that follows after labor. So something that you are refreshed in after you work. And maybe it's because I'm a father of little kids and this is where my mind works, but I thought about going door knocking on October 31st and getting candy. Is that work? Well, yeah, like my kids don't love to walk, but man, if they know that I knock on this door and candy pours out, like, man, it's work, but it's work that I delight in, that I refresh in. So then they carry around this massive bag of candy because they've worked for it, but does it feel like work? No. And then they get home, and then they're, well, at least Briella started doing this last year. She would sort through her candy, and she would basically get all the chocolate, and anything that wasn't chocolate, she would be like, here, like, you have this, Callie. That's all work. Walking, knocking, talking, carrying a burden that gets heavier and heavier, sorting, that's all work. Do any kids complain on the 31st, like, oh man, I can't believe I got to work today? Like, no. We understand it's fruitful work. I do something that doesn't feel like work, and I get a fruitful result from it. That's nuach. That's the best I could come up with. Then you have Shabbat, or the word that we know to be Sabbath, which is literally a ceasing. You stop. It's not like nuach. It is literally rest from labor. This is the word that is found in Genesis chapter 2. On the seventh day, God rested. He stopped. He ceased his work because he had already completed the work in days 1 through 6. Questions or comments on these two words? I want to make sure they're very understood well understood before we move on. All right. Another quote. What does this have to do with anything? Like, that's great. There's two Hebrew words. What is it? What does this have to do with anything? So this comes from another book. This is Matisyahu Savat, who is a Jewish rabbi that wrote this. Man normally is the master of his time. I want you to think about that. This week, we're at Wednesday. We started our first day of the week on Sunday. So from Sunday to today, how many times have you thought already, you know what? God is the master of my day. God is the ruler of my time. This is where my failures begin because I don't think that way. Nor do I really observe that God gets a time in my week. Even my coming here on Wednesdays and Sundays, it's really hard for me to not think of what I'm doing as work and time that goes into my work. And maybe that's because of what I'm doing to myself, but it's really hard for me to think about this time not being a time for God, but more so being a time for myself. He is free to dispose of it as he sees fit, or as a necessity bids him. The Israelite is duty-bound, however, once every 7 days to assert by word and by deed that God is the master of his time. So Tara mentioned the difference between observing and remembering. One, you could say, is by word. I remember. It's a mental exercise. One is by deed. That's what the Jew was called to do. One day out of every single week, you have a repetition. This is a day where by word and by deed, you are going to cease. You're going to stop working. That's the concept of the Shabbat, or the Sabbath day. Because you realize that God is the master of time. One day out of the 7, Israel is to renounce dominion over his own time and recognize God's dominion over it. Simply, every Sabbath day, the Israelite renounces his autonomy and affirms God's dominion over him, in the conclusion that every 7th day, the Israelite is to renounce dominion over time, thereby renounce autonomy and recognize God's dominion over time and thus over himself. Keeping the Sabbath is acceptance of the kingdom and sovereignty of God. Why is the Sabbath day important if you're a Jew? And what does it have to do? What does this pattern have to do with Leviticus chapter 23? Every single one of these holidays are an interruption to your normal schedule, to your normal yearly cycle. There are 7 holidays that interrupt your daily action. What's God's goal with this holy interruption? That you're going to realize the simple lesson: you don't control time. That God has dominion and rule and control over your life and over the time that you're spending. Work doesn't give you value. Work doesn't make you more holy. What God is inviting you to do on the Sabbath, on every single one of these religious holidays in chapter 23, is to experience his holiness and the blessing of his presence and rest in it, to stop working. Because guess what? Even if you were to work on the Sabbath, you are not going to make yourself more holy. That is going to come through God's presence and his blessings and his provisions. Michael?
It's helpful for me when I talk about the Sabbath, or I study the Sabbath, is to look at how it was misunderstood in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
Because whenever you look, I don't think the question, and I'm looking specifically at Mark, the 2nd chapter, the end of that chapter, when Jesus declares that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He's trying to put in order something that they misunderstood. And I think what ended up happening is they had observed the Sabbath, but they had not remembered the Sabbath.
Good point. Yeah.
They may have stopped doing something, the technical aspect of the Sabbath, but they had forgotten God in the Sabbath.
Amen.
They had not remembered what he wanted them to get out of this rest. It's not just a day for you to rest. I want you to remember me and the things that I have done for you, whether it's creation
I like your application that Wednesdays and Sundays might for us become another work day, as opposed to a day where we are utilizing a time that has been set apart by God's people to become, I'm going to summarize what you're saying, God-oriented. That's what Leviticus 23 is about. Observe these days so that you will become more God-oriented and less you-oriented, less focus on your time and the control that you think you have over your time. So I said we in place of like myself. This is again where I'm going to start preaching not from perfection, but because I am disqualified to say that I am observing this. Like I'm really bad at this. But if you fall into this camp, this is where my mindset is wrong. So I preoccupy myself with a lot of work. This is something that in the short time I've been with this family here, some of you have noticed that I'm a yes man. Like whatever you want, whatever you need, I'll do it. I love to preoccupy myself with work. And I think at the root of it, it is because I feel like in some ways I will have some kind of dominion over my life. And that's where God is inviting me to look at myself and say, hey, stop thinking that you have any control over your time. The structure of the Sabbath is supposed to be inconvenient. You might lose out on things. You might not gain something as a kingdom when all the other nations are working on a day that you're called to rest. That's okay, because guess what? You can't add anything to God's dominion. That's a big lesson. God is the master of time, and he holds all the time that we actually think belongs to us. So, what's the big deal? And I called this So What? Like, there's a lot of cool information about the Sabbath. How does this apply to you and I today? So, after sin entered the world, that is described as the fall. So after sin entered the world, there was a change in the fundamental nature of how humanity worked. Before the fall, it was enjoyable by default. Genesis 2:15, then the Lord God took man and nuacked, put him in the garden. A few verses before Genesis 2:15, God is speaking and he's saying there's no one to work, to labor the ground. There's no one to serve or to cultivate the ground. So he creates man and he puts man and he rests him in the garden. Now, before sin entered the world, before we get to the curse of Genesis 3 placed on man and his labor, do you think it was hard work to tend the garden? It's like a kid going out on October 31st. Like, I knock, candy pours out. That's what the work was like. It was a delight. It was a refreshing thing. It's the same language God uses in Revelation when he this word begins to be introduced into the storyline of the Bible. Rested him is this idea, and it's portraying this act of having a full abiding presence. So, as humanity, we are called to be fully present and to abide in this garden that God had created. At 3 o'clock today, I decided to do this. I went and I Googled searched a death clock. So, when will I die, right? I could die right now before I finish this analogy. But I put in some basic health information. I put in my age. I put in where I live. I put in, my marital status, my everything that they asked me to do. 3 o'clock this afternoon, I did this. I got this result. I'm going to live to be 88 years old, which is like 18 more years than I really want to live. I will be 88 1 month and 3 days. So it then goes and breaks it down into 20,000 days, 19 hours, 56 minutes, and 40 seconds remaining. So that time has changed since 3 o'clock this afternoon. I found out some people have like a death day clock on their like desktops at work. Because for them, it's a reminder to say, hey, I don't want to live the remaining hours I have in this life at this office. And I started thinking about this concept. The Sabbath is supposed to remind me that I'm not the master of my time, that God is master over my time. The Sabbath is supposed to remind me, hey, the life that you're living needs to be more God-oriented, less you-oriented. The Sabbath is supposed to remind me, as part of His people, that I am to live a holy life and that God is to have dominion over everything I do. How much of this time that I might have left on this earth am I really going to believe that God has dominion over? Because if you were to ask me, I'm like, man, out of 20,000 days, God would be lucky to get a couple hundred. Because I think I have to work. I'm not talking about physical labor. I'm talking about doing something. To somehow say, God, your presence and your sanctification in my life is not enough. I have to make myself more holy. I have to read and study more. I have to do all these things to make sure that at the end of my life, I've weighed out the scales in my favor. So I started looking for a Bible verse that encapsulated this. And I ended up coming to this psalm, Psalm 90. This is the New American Standard Translation. I've interspersed my own thoughts and explanation into this text. Some of you have asked, how do I come up with lessons or Bible classes? This is basically what I do, all right? So this is an insight into my head. Lord, you have been our dwelling place. So that idea of dwelling place is literally where God lives. So in Leviticus and in the temple, God would have lived in the tabernacle. Now, where does he live? He ought to reside in me. So, God, I'm coming to your home, your house, your dwelling place, where you live. In all generations, before the mountains were born, or you gave birth to the earth, so he labored, and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn man back into dust and say, return, O children of men. This is a citation from Genesis chapter 3, part of the curse that was placed on Adam and Eve for having sinned against God in the garden. They weren't resting in it. They weren't delighting in God's presence, so they suffered the curse that man was going to return to the ground or the dust where he was formed. For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it passes by, or as a watch in the night. That's God's way of saying they're like a few hours. You have swept them away like a flood, intentionally citing Genesis chapters 1 through 11. They fall asleep. In the morning, they are like grass which sprout anew. In the morning, it flourishes and sprouts anew. Toward evening, it fades and withers away. For we have been consumed by your anger and your wrath. And by your wrath, we have been dismayed. You have placed our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days have declined in your fury. I deserve the punishment that I ought to receive for my sins. That's what that verse is saying. They are laid bare before God. We have finished our years like a sigh. That sigh, the New International Version translates to a groan. God's people in Egypt groaned And interestingly enough, God hears their groanings. As for the days of our life, they are contained 70 years, or if due to strength, 80 years. Yet their pride is but labor and sorrow, for soon it is gone, and we will fly away. That's not a good fly away. That's not like one glad. That's talking about your life is a vapor. Like you're here 1 second and you're gone the next. I was teaching Ecclesiastes a couple Mondays ago. And Ecclesiastes is a very sobering book. Yesterday, I can remember being in high school. I remember waking up and going to school. Yesterday, I remember being in college. Yesterday, I remember when I got married to my wife. Yesterday, I remember having a daughter. Tomorrow is Callie's birthday. She'll be 5. I remember the day she was born. I'm 31. Yesterday, I was 16. Your life is like a vapor. Verse 11. Who understands the power of your anger and your fury according to the fear that is due you? So teach us to number our days that we may present, and that word present is offer or give up to you a heart of wisdom. Do return, O Lord. How long will it be? And be sorry for your servants. Again, that's a call to Moses' speech to the Israelites when he is interceding for them. God, don't bring your anger down on these people. Oh, satisfy. And this is cool. I didn't know this word in Hebrew was here when I picked this psalm. The word satisfy is the word sabah. And it means to be satiated, to be full. The same word is used in Exodus 16. They were given bread, manna from heaven, until they were sabah. They were satisfied. They were full. It's found again in verse 12. We'll see it at the end of Leviticus that a curse is going to be, you're not going to be sabah. You're not going to be satiated. That word is a play on words in the Hebrew language. The word literally means 7. Oh, 7. Oh, Sabbath is what he's saying. Us. Fill us, satisfy us, complete us in the morning with your loving kindness, that we may sing for joy and be glad all our days. Make us glad according to the days you have afflicted us, and the years we have seen as evil. Let your work, for our work is just done for survival. My work comes and goes. I work today, I'm going to work tomorrow. My work doesn't produce end. My work is for survival, and it just brings about more death. Appear to your servants and your majesty to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and confirm for us the work of our hands. Yes, confirm the work of our hands. Make our work firm. That's literally what it means. Turn our work into something that will last, not something that's going to just end with my time. Our work, like our lives, wither and die. That's what I have to gain for all my work. My attempts to strive for more holiness is not going to produce more holiness. It just leads me closer to death. But when God satisfies us with rest, through his new creation, through the new birth, his work doesn't fade. He gives us work, bread and drink that leaves us satiated and leads us towards abundant life. The Sabbath, the seventh day, is about new creation or liberation and a completion of God's labor and work. Sorry. Here's the great thing, though. As a Christian, I don't have to wait till Friday at sundown to observe the Sabbath. Because of those passages that I asked you to read or to study, Hebrews chapter 4, Colossians chapter 2, Romans 14, Michael cited this from the book of Mark. This is from the book of Matthew. Jesus is our Sabbath rest. What does that mean for you and I? I get to delight in God's rest every single day, if that's what I want. I'm not good at that. I'm not at a point where I delight in God's completion. And I know that that's true because I feel like if I take a single day off, someone is going to draw further away from God, or someone is not going to hear the gospel, or someone is just going to fail God. But Jesus says he is Lord of the Sabbath. What is he saying? Not that he just created the Sabbath, not that he is master over the Sabbath, but he's saying the same thing that he does when he says the kingdom of God is here. He's saying that he is the beginning of this new creation. And Jesus is placing a greater importance on this concept of the Sabbath. Not that I have to stop working every 7 days, not that I have to learn the Jewish ritual calendar in Leviticus 23, but he is saying what the Sabbath pointed to. And it is a time of constant communion between God and man. And that time is here because Jesus is here. Right before Matthew chapter 12 and verse 8, Jesus ends Matthew 11, talking about his yoke. And I think many of us are aware of what Jesus says about his yoke. Come, take my yoke, all you who are weary and heavy laden. I don't think I realize how weary I am. And maybe my wanting to teach on the Sabbath again was just another reason that I wanted to study this further. If you don't feel completely satisfied in God, it's not because God cannot completely satisfy you. It's because you are not resting and being refreshed in him. But he says, come, take my yoke. Make your burden lighter. And it's easy and it's light. Accept my completion of the doctrine and the law that I've been able to fulfill. And that's what I get to delight in every day if I desire. So that completes our study of the Sabbath and Leviticus 23. Any final questions or comments? All right, well, y'all are dismissed. Thank you so much.